I'm Trevor Stevenson, and welcome to Your Story Will Be Different. This is a narrative play podcast where I tell you the story born through a playthrough of a solo tabletop role-playing game. For this session, we're playing Fairyland Confidential by Nick Dublin. It's a mashup of film noir and fairy shenanigans, in which you play a detective investigating a murder in a town that borders on the Fae realm itself. It's a lot of fun. Let's dive right in. The soft hiss of rain against my window drowned out the buzz of neon lights beyond it. It was late, and my last client of the day, maybe the week, had just walked through the door. A kid, really. Couldn't have been more than 17. She was nervous, fiddling with the hem of her coat like she was trying to unravel it.
Mr. Dublin?
She asked, her voice shaky. That's what the door says. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Blonde curls peeked out from under her hood, her face pale as the moon. She looked like she'd walked out of some fairy tale, which wasn't out of the question. Have a seat. You got a name?
Janet Bird.
She perched on the edge of a chair, knees pressed together like she was bracing for a storm. What's on your mind, Janet? I asked, reaching for my notepad on my desk. Most kids her age came looking for runaway pets or to track down a boyfriend gone AWOL. I had a feeling she wasn't here for either.
I need your help getting something. A plant.
That caught my attention. My pen hovered over the page. A plant? What kind of plant needs a private detective to get it?
A poisoned rose.
You know those are illegal to bring across the border, right? Dangerous stuff, especially for humans.
I know, but I need it. I'm willing to pay.
Let's start with why you need it. Poison roses aren't exactly for decoration. We both know that they're the fairy herbs, abortifacients. Who's the unlucky guy? Her cheeks flushed.
He's not human. He's Fae. He swore an oath to Catalexis, a fairy queen. He can't be with me. If she finds out, it'll doom him.
I frowned. Catalexis was bad news. A queen with ties to hell and a penchant for keeping her oaths sharp and cruel. Every 7 years, she sent one of her servants to the abyss to keep her immortality intact. If this guy was on her radar, Janet was playing with literal hellfire. You're telling me you want to save him, and you think a poison rose is the way to do it? She nodded, her hands twisting in her lap.
He said if we had it, we could break the bond, but I can't get it on my own.
I studied her for a long moment. There was more to her story. There always was, but she wasn't about to share it. Sorry, kid, you're asking for trouble. I don't run smuggling ops. For a moment, I thought she'd cry, but she stood, smoothing out her coat.
I understand. Thank you for your time.
She was gone before I could say anything else. And a month later, she was dead. Halloween was always quiet compared to Fae-free towns. Fae folk always told me it was a faux pas to celebrate something so pejorative. Even humans stayed in. The crime scene was quiet except for the faint creak of ivy shifting in the breeze. The jasmine vines wrapped around the small apartment like a strangler's grip, spilling out of broken windows and curling around the fire escape. The smell of the flowers was sickly sweet and completely at odds with the horror inside. I ducked under the police tape, the cheap leather of my coat brushing the taut yellow ribbon. The uniform at the door gave me a once-over, his face souring when he recognized me.
Dublin,
he grunted.
Didn't know they called the likes of you.
They didn't. I flashed the business card Janet had left on my desk weeks ago. I'm here on my own. He snorted but waved me through. Inside, the scent of jasmine was overwhelming, clinging to everything. Tendrils had spread across the room, winding over furniture, splitting plaster, and choking what was left of the girl on the bed. Janet Bird's lifeless body was cocooned in the vines, her face pale and serene, like she'd fallen asleep in the garden. But the bruising on her neck told a different story. The vines had done their work with arcane precision, leaving no chance of escape. There was a detective already inside, his trench coat as rumpled as his mood. He glanced up when he saw me, his lips curled in something between a smile and a grimace.
Dublin, you don't quit, do you?
Somebody's got to pick up the pieces, I said, stepping over a shattered vase to get close to the bed. The vines hadn't just strangled her. They'd grown into the mattress, punching through the wood and fabric. I crouched, inspecting the floorboards. Jasmine vines, as far as the eye could see. This isn't natural. The detective gave a bitter chuckle.
Welcome to the obvious. Forensics found fairy magic all over the scene. Could be smuggling, could be revenge. Maybe she ticked off the wrong elf.
What about the plant? I asked, gesturing to the remains of a shattered clay pot on the windowsill. Soil spilled out in dark clumps, the roots of the jasmine plant long dead. Anything off about it?
You mean other than the vines going full Jack and the Beanstalk?
The detective asked. He crossed his arms.
We found a skull in the soil. Forensics is working on it, but they're dragging their feet. Face stuff spooks them.
I straightened, glancing at Janet's face. She'd been terrified the day she came to me, but desperate enough to risk anything. Who found her?
The boyfriend. Mo Darlington. Guy says he was asleep next to her when it happened, untouched by the vines, if you can believe it.
Where is he now?
In holding. We wanted a few words before he lawyered up.
I nodded, running a hand over my chin. Keep him there. I want to crack at him. The detective sighed.
Suit yourself, Dublin, but don't get any ideas. You can't save her now.
No, I couldn't. But I could find the bastard who killed her. The interrogation room was about as inviting as a morgue. The flickering fluorescent lights and a lingering smell of fear. Mo Darlington sat across from me, his shirt rumpled and his hands clenched into fists on the metal table. He looked young, too young for this. There was a hardness in his eyes that told me life hadn't been kind. The overhead light reflected off the silver charm around his neck. Its pendant shaped like a pair of dice. Lucky charm, maybe. But from what I've heard about his gambling debts, he needed it. You're Mo, the boyfriend.
Wasn't her boyfriend. Not really.
That's so? Explain. All the symptoms are there. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair.
It wasn't like that. Janet, she asked me to pretend. Her mom, her sister, they were breathing down her neck, asking questions she didn't want to answer. So she told them we were together. It was just a cover.
A cover for what? He hesitated, eyes darting to the door like he was looking for an escape route. Finally, he whispered,
She was protecting someone. A fae.
I felt my stomach tighten slightly. You're saying she was involved with someone from the other side? Mo nodded, his gaze meeting mine for the first time.
She didn't tell me much, just that he was in trouble. Big trouble. She was trying to get him out.
Out from what?
From a fairy queen. Catalexis.
The name hung in the air like a lingering threat. Didn't like hearing that name so much in one case. That's a hell of a name to drop. You're saying Janet was tangled up with one of Catalexis's men?
Yeah, night or something.
Mo swallowed hard, his fingers tapping nervously on the table.
Tamberlane, she called him. Said she couldn't let him go back. Catalexis, she does something to them. Sends them to hell or some other awful plane.
Filed that away for later. Let's talk about last night. You were in the room when it happened. Mo nodded, his face pale.
We went to bed like normal. She was quiet, thinking about something. I fell asleep, and then when I woke up, the room was full of vines. They were everywhere. I tried to pull her out, but they wouldn't let go. I couldn't do anything.
And the vines didn't touch you.
No, I swear, I didn't do anything. I loved Janet. She was my friend.
Friend enough to cover for her secrets, or friend enough to kill her to cover your own.
I didn't kill her. I'd never hurt her.
Maybe not, but someone did. They had a damn good reason for it. As I walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mo was telling the truth. But if everything I'd heard about Catalexis was true, I couldn't go in there half-cocked. I needed more evidence. The flower garden was a quiet retreat in the chaos of the city. The mingling scent of roses and freshly turned earth filled the air. Eglantine, the rose elf, flittered around the edges of the garden, her wings catching the light like a shard of stained glass. She was no taller than a child's hand, but her presence filled the space with an unnerving intensity.
You didn't have to call me. I don't appreciate being dragged into human nonsense.
Funny, it seems like human nonsense is what got Janet killed. You lived in her garden, didn't you? Eglantine perched on a rose stem, crossing her arms.
I did. Until she told me to leave.
She kicked you out?
She asked me to go. I'm not sure why. She didn't say. One day, she was friendly. The next, she was nervous. Afraid, even. Humans are fickle like that.
Afraid of what? Eglantine hesitated, her tiny hands smoothing her dress.
I thought maybe her family. Her mother especially. That woman hated the Fae, even if she tolerated us for her daughter's sake.
What about the vines? Jasmine doesn't grow wild around here, let alone fast enough to strangle someone in a single night.
You think I'd waste my magic on Jasmine? I'm a rose elf. Jasmine is beneath me. Besides, I had no quarrel with Janet. She was kind. Naive, but kind.
She snorted, fluttering her wings. Her indignation seemed genuine, but I wasn't about to let her off easy. She kicked you out. You saying you didn't feel the slightest bit of resentment?
Of course I did. But not enough to kill her. What do you take me for? A common gremlin?
I held up my hands. Easy, just covering all the angles. She sighed, her wings drooping slightly.
Janet was a good person, Mr. Dublin. She had secrets, yes, but she didn't deserve this. If you want my advice, look at the ones closest to her. They always have the sharpest knives.
I considered her words for a moment. You mentioned her being nervous. Did she say anything about why? Eglantine shook her head.
Only that she'd gotten herself into something she couldn't handle. She thought she could save someone, but the price was too high.
And you don't know who she was trying to save.
A knight, I think. She mentions Catalexis once, but she wouldn't say more. I told her she was reaching for branches too high to grasp, but she wouldn't listen.
I nodded, mulling over the new pieces of the puzzle. All right, Eglantine. That'll be all for now. Stay in town, though. I may have more questions. She gave a sarcastic little bow.
I live here, Mr. Dublin. Unlike some, I don't run from my troubles.
Eglantine was too proud and too smart to orchestrate a murder this elaborate. This meant the killer was still out there. Della Graves opened the door, wearing a housecoat that had seen better days, and a scowl that looked like it hadn't left her face in years. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen life's hard edges. The small apartment smelled of stale coffee and yesterday's regrets. She stepped aside, letting me in without a word. "Miss Graves?" I said, scanning the room. A patched-up sofa and a cluttered coffee table told me money wasn't flowing freely here. "Thanks for agreeing to talk."
Didn't agree to anything, but you're here, so let's get it over with.
I took a seat on the sofa, noting the faint smear of dirt on the toe of her slipper. "I'm here about Janet."
What about her?
"About why someone wanted her dead. She was tangled up in some Fae business, but you knew that, didn't you?" She flinched. A subtle movement, but enough to tell me I'd struck a nerve.
I don't know what you're talking about.
"Come on, Della. Janet was your half-sister. You lived with her. You telling me you didn't notice anything off?" She looked away, chewing on the inside of her cheek.
She was different the last few weeks. Always looking over her shoulder like someone was watching her.
"Who?"
I don't know. She wouldn't tell me anything. She kept saying it was better if I didn't know.
"Better for you or for her?" Della glared at me, but the fight in her seemed to drain out. She sank into a chair across from me, her hands gripping the armrests.
She was trying to help someone. A man. A Fae. Said he needed her help to escape some queen or other. I told her to stay out of it, but she didn't listen.
That man's name wouldn't happen to be Tamberlane, would it? Her eyes widened just enough to confirm it.
You already know, don't you? Yeah, that was him. She thought she was saving him. I thought she was digging her own grave.
I leaned back, letting her words settle. What about Mo? What was their arrangement really about?
Janet said Mo was a Fae beard, to keep Mom and me off her back. I didn't approve, but I figured it was harmless enough.
I shifted gears. Let's talk about the night she died. You weren't home, were you? She shook her head.
I was out looking for work. Came back to find the place crawling with cops.
I glanced down at her slippers, noting the dirt again. Mind if I asked where you went?
Downtown. Why? You think I killed my own sister?
I think you had a lot to lose if Janet kept meddling in Fae business. Financial troubles, tension in the house. Sounds like motive to me. She stood abruptly, her hand shaking.
You think whatever you want, Mr. Dublin. But I loved my sister. I'd never hurt her.
Then you won't mind if I check into your story. I left with a nagging feeling. Della had secrets, but murder didn't seem to be one of them. Still, the dirt on her shoes and the way she danced around my questions meant I couldn't rule her out just yet. The portal to the Fae realm loomed in the shadows of the city's old quarter, a swirling curtain of green and gold light. It was quiet here, save for the faint hum of the magic that kept the world stitched together. Stepping through always left a strange taste in my mouth. like copper and honey mixed with regret. This time was no different. On the other side, the air was different. Warmer, heavier, laced with the scent of blooming flowers and something sharper, like ozone. The world around me shimmered with surreal beauty. Colors seemed brighter, sounds richer, and shadows deeper. I wasn't here for the view, though. My destination was the crystalline palace of Catalexis, the queen whose name was whispered in fear on both sides of the portal. The fairy guards, with their cold eyes and sharp smiles, escorted me through a maze of corridors until I reached her cavernous throne room. Catalexis lounged on a throne made out of silver thorns. Her gown flowed like molten starlight. Her presence was overwhelming, a mix of beauty and terror that made it hard to breathe.
Detective Nick Dublin. What an unexpected pleasure,
she said, her voice as smooth as a spider's web. I doubt it's much of a pleasure. I'm here about Janet Bird. Her expression didn't change, but the air seemed to grow colder.
The mortal girl who meddled in affairs beyond her comprehension.
She's dead, strangled by jasmine vines. The kind of thing that reeks of fairy magic. Catalexis tilted her head, her silver hair cascading over one shoulder.
Do you think I killed her, Mr. Dublin?
Did you? I let the question hang. She laughed, a sound that echoed in my nightmares for years.
If I wanted her dead, there wouldn't be a shred of doubt about my involvement. No mortal or fae could challenge me on it.
She helped Tamburlaine escape your service. That had to sting. Her laughter faded. Her eyes narrowed.
Tamburlaine made his choice. If he thought fleeing to the mortal realm would free him from the consequences of his oath, he was mistaken.
You didn't answer my question. Catalexis rose from her throne. Each step felt like a calculated display of power.
Janet Bird's death does not serve me, Mr. Dublin. Quite the opposite, in fact. Without Tamburlaine, I have no sacrifice for my pact. Do you understand what that means?
Your power's on the line.
Precisely.
Her gaze was colder than death.
Her death has hindered me, not helped me.
Unless it was a warning, a message to Tamburlaine, or anyone else thinking of crossing you. Catalexis stepped closer.
I do not need to send messages. My power is its own warning.
We stared each other down. Finally, she turned away, her voice soft but deadly.
Find your answers elsewhere, Mr. Dublin, but tread carefully. Some truths are better left buried.
As I left the palace, her words echoed in my mind. Catalexis didn't strike me as a liar, but she was too clever to show her hand. If she wasn't behind Janet's death, then Tamburlaine had more to answer for. The holding cell was cold and dimly lit, the thick walls muffling the noise of the station. Mo Darlington sat on the edge of his cot, his head in his hands. When he heard me approach, he looked up. I saw his eyes were rimmed red from exhaustion and tears. I wasn't there to comfort him.
You again? Didn't the cops get enough out of me?
Not quite. I pulled up a chair outside the bars. We need to talk about Janet again.
I told you everything I know.
Maybe. I pulled out my notebook. But maybe you left something out. Let's start with this. Why didn't the vines touch you? Mo frowned, shaking his head.
I don't know. I woke up and they were already all over her. I tried to help, but nothing. They didn't come near me.
That's convenient, I said, flipping a page. Almost like they knew you were there.
What are you implying? I didn't do anything to her.
Then who did? I leaned forward, letting the weight of the question hang in the air between us. You're close to her. You were there when it happened. You got debts and secrets, Mo. The pieces don't look good for you. He stood abruptly, pacing the small space like a caged animal.
I didn't kill her. Why would I? Janet was the only one who believed in me. She was helping me, for crying out loud.
Helping you how? He stopped. His hands gripped the bars of the window.
She knew I was in debt. Bad debt. She thought she could help me get out of it. Maybe with fey magic or something. She was always looking for ways to help people, even when she shouldn't.
And Tamblerine? How does he fit into this? Mo turned. I could see how pale his face was now.
I didn't like him. I told her not to trust him. But she thought he needed saving. Said he'd been a prisoner for centuries, that Catalexis would kill him if she didn't help.
Why didn't you say this before?
Because it didn't matter. Tamberlane didn't kill her. He was terrified of Catalexis, sure, but Janet? Janet was the only one who believed he could escape her.
You're awful certain he's innocent.
I just don't think he'd hurt her. She saved his life. Why would he throw that away?
I leaned back, letting his words settle. Maybe he was more afraid of Catalexis than he let on. Or maybe he wasn't as innocent as you think. Mo sat down on the cot, his head in his hands again.
I don't know. I just know that Janet didn't deserve this.
I stood, tucking my notebook away. No, she didn't. But someone thought otherwise. The birdhouse was an austere building in a quiet neighborhood, its windows shuttered and its front yard devoid of the flowers that had thrived in this part of town. Olivia Bird, Janet's mother, met me at the door with an expression carved from stone. She was a tall woman, her posture rigid, her hair gray, pulled back into a severe bun. Behind her, the house was just as stark, every surface polished and cold.
Mr. Dublin, you've come to speak about my daughter?
That's right. I took in the Spartan living room. The furniture looked more for show than comfort, the kind of house that wasn't a home, a domicile that held as many secrets as memories. I appreciate you seeing me.
I'd like to know why.
She said, crossing her arms.
The police already asked their questions. What more could you possibly want?
Answers. Janet didn't just die. She was murdered. I'm trying to figure out why. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing, waiting for me to continue. Let's start with her relationship with Mo Darlington. She told people he was her boyfriend. Did you believe that?
I didn't approve of Mo, and I made that clear to Janet. He was a degenerate, a gambler with no future. Oh, but Janet was stubborn. She wouldn't listen.
Was it just Mo you disapproved of, or was it the Fae she was involved with? I asked, watching her closely. Olivia's expression darkened.
I've made my views on the Fae abundantly clear, Mr. Dublin. They don't belong here. Their magic, their deceit, it's corruption of everything human. I raised Janet to understand that.
And yet she didn't seem to share your convictions.
No, she didn't. I blame her father for that. He filled her head with stories of the Fae. Fairy tales that led her to believe they were something to be admired. When he died, I tried to undo the damage, but...
She trailed off, her composure faltering for the first time. I waited a moment before pressing on. Did you know Janet was trying to help someone? A fae named Tamblerain?
I suspected. She was secretive, more than usual, in the weeks before her death. I thought it had something to do with Mo, but now... A fae knight. How utterly revolting.
You didn't approve of her choices, but did you disapprove enough to hurt her? Her gaze snapped to mine, sharp as a blade.
She was my daughter. Whatever misguided decision she made, I would never harm her.
I met her glare, weighing her words. There was no lie in her voice, no hesitation in her denial. Olivia Bird was a lot of things. Rigid, bitter, and deeply prejudiced. But a killer? I wasn't convinced. I believe you, I said, standing. But if you know anything at all, that might help, now is the time to share it. She straightened, her mask of composure snapping back into place.
All I know is that Janet got involved in something far bigger than she understood. And whoever is responsible for her death, I hope they rot.
I could tell that Olivia's cockles were far too bristled to keep pressing on. Olivia wasn't the killer. Her grief and anger were too genuine. But her hatred of the Fae had pushed Janet into secrets and lies, and those choices had cost her everything. I found Tamblerain in the dingy boarding house that Mo had mentioned in our conversation. A building that smelled of mildew and desperation. It wasn't hard to spot the knight. He didn't belong here. His long, weathered coat and scarred hands had a story to tell. But it was the haunted look in his eyes that stood out the most. When I stepped into the room, he barely glanced up from the small table where he sat, sharpening a battered sword.
If you've come to kill me, get in line.
I'm not here to kill you, just to ask a few questions. He snorted and set the sword down.
Questions don't help anyone, least of all me.
Janet Bird thought otherwise. I saw his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. She thought you were worth saving, gave her life to make sure you got out of Catalexis' clutches.
She shouldn't have. I told her to leave me. I told her it wasn't worth it.
But she didn't listen. Why is that? What did you tell her to make her think you were worth risking everything? Tamblerain leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling.
I told her the truth, that Catalexis had chosen me as his sacrifice. That if I didn't escape, I'd be dragged to hell on All Souls' Day.
And you let her help you, knowing what it could cost her.
She insisted. Janet was tenacious. She thought she could change things. She didn't understand how dangerous this world is.
Or maybe she understood too well. Maybe she saw through your act, the brave knight playing the victim. Tamblerain's eyes narrowed.
Careful, detective.
I'm just calling it how I see it. You needed a way out. She was naive enough to give it to you. But when Catalexis didn't come for you, maybe you got scared. Maybe you thought killing Janet would cover your tracks. He shot to his feet, his hand on the hilt of his sword.
I didn't kill her.
Prove it. Because right now, all I see is a man with everything to gain from her death.
I told you, I didn't... Catalexis, she wouldn't stop hunting me. Janet knew that. She thought that if I stayed in the mortal world, I'd be safe. She didn't realize I'd never be safe.
And neither was she. Whoever killed her wanted you to suffer. You think that's coincidence? He stared at me, his face pale.
No, but it wasn't me.
Then start talking. Because if you're innocent, you're running out of people who will believe you. He didn't answer, and the silence told me all I needed to know. Tambourine was scared of Catalexis, of the past, of what Janet's death meant. But fear and guilt had a way of looking a lot like motive. On my second visit to Catalexis, the fairy realm was darker this time. The vibrant greens and gold of my first visit were muted, replaced by larger shadows that stretched too far and whispers that didn't belong to the wind. Catalexis was waiting for me, her expression even colder than before.
You return.
Her voice cut through the air like a scythe.
I assume you have more accusations to fling.
No accusations this time, I said, stopping short of her throne. Just questions. She tilted her head, her silver hair gleaming in the dim light.
Ask them then, if you must.
Tambourine says you're still hunting him, that Janet's death wasn't your doing because it made your job harder. So if you didn't kill her, who did? Catalexis's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes.
Mortals are so quick to point fingers, so quick to believe their little stories. But the truth, Mr. Dublin, is often far more complicated.
Complicated doesn't help me solve a murder. You wanted Tambourine back, but he's still in the mortal world, which means you're running out of options. Did you send someone after him?
I did not. Tambourin's escape humiliated me, but I do not waste my power on petty vengeance. Janet Bird's death serves no purpose for me. As I've said before.
Then who else had a stake in her life? Catalexis leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with something ancient and dangerous.
Have you considered that Janet's death was not about her at all? That it was a message meant for someone else?
My stomach twisted. Tambourine. She sat back with a deliberate grace.
Perhaps, or perhaps it was for you, Detective. You've stepped into a world you do not understand. Do you think it wise to dig deeper?
I ignored the chill creeping up my spine. Wise or not, I'm not stopping till I find the truth. Catalexis laughed softly, further echoing in my mind.
Then I wish you luck, Mr. Dublin. You'll need it.
She hadn't given me much, but it was enough to push me back towards the mortal world. Someone was playing a dangerous game. If I didn't figure out who soon, there'd be more bodies to count. The streets were quiet when I made my way back to the mortal world, the kind of quiet that made the city feel like it was holding its breath for something. My mind churned with everything I'd heard. Catalexis's warnings, Moe's pleas, Tambourine's fear. It all pointed to a truth that I couldn't quite grasp. But one thing was clear. Janet Bird's death wasn't a random act. It was deliberate, calculated, and meant to send a message. Every clue, every detail, every lie, it all had to mean something. The jasmine vines, the skull in the pot, Tambourine's escape, Catalexis's dwindling power. I took a long drag from a cigarette and let the smoke curl around me. There was one piece of this puzzle I hadn't turned over enough. The skull in the jasmine pot. Forensics hadn't ID'd it yet, but the fact was it was human, or close enough, stuck with me. Someone had gone to the trouble of burying it with the plant. Someone who wanted Janet dead. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Before I could answer, it swung open and Olivia Bird stepped inside, her presence as sharp and unyielding as the scowl she wore.
I told you to stay away from my family.
And I told you I don't take orders. What do you want? Her eyes flicked to the notes on my desk.
You're digging into things you don't understand. Janet was my daughter. Whatever happened to her, it's done. Leave it alone.
Your daughter's murder isn't done until I say it is. You know more than you're letting on. About her, about Tam Lorraine, about all of it. Olivia's face tightened, her hands balling into fists.
I wanted to protect her. From the Fae, from their lies. She thought she could save him. She thought love would be enough. But it never is.
You mean Tam Lorraine? You didn't approve of him.
Of course not. He's Fae. He's dangerous.
But you didn't kill her? Her silence was answer enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost broken.
No, I didn't.
I nodded. Olivia left without another word, and I was alone again. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed wasn't one I liked. Someone had manipulated Janet, used her love, her desperation, to send a message that cut deeper than any words. And I was about to find out just how sharp that message was. The rain came down in sheets as I made my way back to Tam Lorraine's boarding house. The streets were nearly empty, the world painted in shades of gray under the dim glow of the street lamps. Something about this case hadn't settled right with me, and Tam Lorraine was the last loose thread. I intended to pull everything to unravel it. When I opened the door, he looked worse than before. Haunted eyes, trembling hands, and the kind of exhaustion that spoke of more than just a lack of sleep.
Ah, you again. I already told you I didn't kill her.
And yet here I am, I said, pushing past him into the room. Sit down. We need to talk. He closed the door.
What more do you want from me?
The truth. About Janet. About Cat Alexis. About why a girl like her ended up dead with vines around her neck. Tam Lorraine sank into a chair by the table.
I told you everything I know.
No. You told me what you wanted me to believe. But I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's holding back. Janet died trying to save you, but that jasmine didn't grow itself. Someone wanted her dead, and I think you know who. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table.
I didn't.
Don't lie to me. The skull in the pot, the vines that killed her, that wasn't random. That was deliberate. Someone sent that plant to her, and it wasn't Cat Alexis. So who was it? Tam Lorraine's eyes darted at the window, as if the answer might be hiding in the storm outside.
I didn't mean for her to die.
What did you do?
I thought it would scare her. She was too close, too, determined. I told her to stay away from me, to stop meddling, but she wouldn't listen, so I sent the jasmine. I had heard that it was an old Fae trick to warn people and scare them off.
A warning. That just happened to come with a human skull and vines strong enough to strangle someone. He buried his face in his hands.
I didn't know. I didn't think.
That much is obvious. But you didn't stop it. You knew what could happen, and yet you let it play out. He looked up at me, His face was drawn and pale.
She was supposed to stay away. I didn't want her to die.
And now her blood is on your hands. Tambourin didn't argue. Didn't try to defend himself. He just sat there, broken and silent, as the truth hung heavy in the air. Janet Bird had died because of his fear, his desperation to escape a life he couldn't face. And now he'd have to live with the consequences. Tambourin sat in silence as the rain outside had slowed to a soft patter. The storm had lost its fury, but inside the tension was thick enough to choke. You're going to have to answer for this.
I didn't want this.
It doesn't matter what you wanted. What matters is what you did. Janet trusted you. She believed in you. And you used that to destroy her. The weight of his guilt was clearly enough to pin him in place. The detective for the case on the police force wouldn't like it, but I knew he'd show up. Tambourin might not be human, but murder was still murder. And there were laws about this sort of thing, at least on this side of the portal. Before I could dial, Tambourin's voice stopped me.
Dublin, do you think this will change anything? Do you think dragging me in will stop the Fae from taking more lives? Or humans from throwing themselves into things they just don't understand?
It's not about the rest of the world, Tambourin. It's about justice for Janet.
Justice. There's no such thing in a world like this.
It's where you're wrong, Tambourin. Maybe it's been so long since you were a human, but it's rare. It's fragile, but it does exist. I'm damn sure not going to let you get away without it. I made the call, and within minutes, the faint wail of sirens cut through the night. Tambourin didn't resist when the cops arrived. The detective slapped cuffs on him with a grim expression, his partner reading the night his rights in a tone that lacked conviction, and Tambourin was led away. A week later, I sat in my office. The case file spread across my desk. Janet's death had made the papers, but the details were sparse. The Fae connection was downplayed, as it always was, and Tambourin's trial was still a ways off. The jasmine plant was gone, incinerated by the authorities. The skull and the soil? Unidentified, though I had my theories. Fae magic works in strange ways, and the roots of this case stretched further than I care to dig. Catalexis had sent me a message. A single white rose left on my desk the morning after Tambourin's arrest. No note, no signature. Just a reminder that even with Tambourin locked up, the power balance between our worlds was as precarious as ever. I poured myself a glass of cheap whiskey from my drawer and lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl towards the ceiling. Janet Bird was gone, but her story wasn't over. It was written in the cracks between our worlds, in the shadows where humans and Fae collided. It took another long drag, exhaling slowly. Another life lost, and this city keeps moving, swallowing the pain like it always did. I thought about Tambourin's words and justice. Fragile as it was, it had been served. But in a city like this, there was always need for people like me to fill in the cracks between the two worlds. I absolutely love film noir movies. I know a lot of people that find comfort in listening to true crime podcasts, for me, if you put on an old school film noir movie, it's super comforting for me. I absolutely love The Third Man. I think it's one of the best movies ever made. It's got lots of twists and turns to it. So when I came across Fairyland Confidential, I was incredibly excited to see something that was allowing me to play as a detective in a film noir style, but also adding in the supernatural elements of the Fae. And for anyone who watched Carnival Row, that was on Amazon not that long ago, it was kind of the same thing, where it was an investigation into various nefarious things that were happening in a world that had both a Fae element, but also a more human element. This was obviously a different tone, a different setting from that show, but I kept thinking about it while I was playing it. But we should definitely talk about the elephant in the room. That plot was incredibly twisted and did not make a ton of sense. And what's interesting about it is in the actual manual by Nick Dublin for Fairyland Confidential, there's a whole section where he talks about the untidy plot. And he talks about the example of The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, where people asked him afterwards, how did he come up with that plot? And he effectively said it was messy and it just kind of came together as he was writing it. And I think that actually works very well for this game because the mechanics of it, you are steadily going through and eliminating who the potential suspects are for this murder. And there you have 6 suspects, as you heard, and you bounce back and forth depending upon the rolls. And you one by one, depending upon the rolls and also the cards that you roll, you flip over as you play, you are eliminating which suspects. And the last one is the one that committed the crime. All the while this is happening, the danger level is rising, or there are 2 possibilities for failure in this. One is the danger level where something film noir-esque happens to you and your character dies, whether they get some concrete shoes and thrown into the river. Or there's also the tribulation one, which is where the Fae realm becomes so much that you essentially are lost to it. I happened to luck out with my rolls and my card flips to the point where I was down to 2 suspects, Catalexis and Tamerlane, as you heard. The thing was that the rolls at a certain point kind of stagnated, and I kept having to go back and forth, trying to figure it out until finally I got to the point where I could eliminate Catalexis as the malevolent figure that ended up killing Janet. In keeping with this podcast theme of an actual narrative play sort of thing, it is very messy, this story, but ultimately it kind of comes together. And all the while I was having a blast playing it and just thinking about Nick Dublin going between worlds trying to figure out and solve this murder. It's an absolute blast, especially if you're a film noir junkie like I am. This episode featured the talents of Helen Clare as Janet Bird, Jacob Thomas as Mo Darlington, Scarlett Estevez as Eglantine, Elise Soder as Della Graves, Karen Michelle as Catalexis, Chris Carr as Olivia Bird, and Logan Peets as Tamerlane. A special shout out to my friends at Speak Friends Studio for teaching and coordinating these amazing voiceover artists. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can learn all that they do. Thank you again for listening to Your Story Will Be Different. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to leave a 5-star review on your platform of choice and leaving a written review on Apple Podcasts. For our next session, we're going to be playing Dragon Dowser, in which you are out searching into a fantastical world to recover dragon eggs as they've become an endangered species thanks to overhunting by mankind. As always, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to Fairyland Confidential by Nick Dublin. And feel free to reach out on social media to let me know how your adventure in the film noir/fairy world goes. But just remember, your story will be different.